Okay, let's get started. So first, just a few announcements. I think all of you probably found the website by now. On the website, there's a link to the PDF of the slides. So the video also has the slides in them, but the advantage of the PDF are two. First of all, it has all of my drawings that I make at the whiteboard. You'll see those are slides I didn't show in class. And it also has yellow virtual Post-its that might have comments or clarifications, or someone asked a question, or if there was a mistake on my slide. So you can find those Post-its. The other link is to the recorded video. And I know there's a problem with alphabet companies right now, and I'm working to fix that permissions problem. We'll get through it. Okay. As far as the Dory goes, excuse me. So for the remote audience, use the Dory in class, but I will erase the Dory after class. I'll look at the Dory after class and see if there are some additional questions, and I'll answer them, but I'll erase them before the next class. So if you want to ask questions that persist, use the group mailing list. Okay, so just a reminder, if you want to follow along with the readings, I assigned 2 chapters. They're listed also on the course schedule, chapters 2 and 13. And then if you'd like to do the assignments, there's an assignment, bad photographs, due this Sunday. All right, so today we'll continue where we left off on exposure, and we'll finish that. And then I'll do mostly a bunch of fun stuff today, and we'll start the heavier derivations and technical stuff on Monday when we talk about optics. So I'll give a little history of the beginning of photography, and a kind of a fun lecture lit on extreme photography. And then, assuming I have time, I have a little thing on choosing a camera, in case you want to choose a camera with manual control over shutter and aperture for this course. Okay, so we were here last time, and we were saying that we wanted irradiance to be, that irradiance was proportional to the square of the aperture diameter, and inversely proportional to the square of the distance to the sensor. And so in order that there weren't these extra variables, photographers made up this number, n equals f over a, that's the f number, in order to factor out the focal length. And so doubling this number, if you hold f constant, reduces a by 2x. Since that's the diameter, that reduces the light by 4x. So going from f2 to f4 cuts the light by 4x. So we had this doubling scale for shutter time. It'd be nice if we had a doubling scale for exposure as well. And so the way to do that then is to cut the light by 2x, only increase n by square root of 2. So that's kind of inconvenient, but in fact, that's exactly the derivation of the weird numbers that you see as f numbers on a camera. They differ from one another by the square root of 2. f2, 8, f4, f5, 6, 8, 11, 16, those weird numbers all differ by a factor of the square root of 2. So if the diameter changes by the square root of 2, then the area and the amount of light and the irradiance on your sensor will change by a factor of 2. All right, so we have enough to do another little brain teaser. Let's see if we can use what we've learned. Does an f2 cell phone lens gather as much light from each patch of the scene as an f2 single lens reflex camera? Okay, so f2 is not that unreasonable. This is f2. This is the Nexus XP. Okay, so let's work through some properties. A smaller lens is typically, like the one on a cell phone, is typically accompanied by a smaller focal length, so you can fit it into a nice thin phone. And by decreasing the focal length at the same time you decrease the size of the lens, you keep the field of view, the angular field of view, about the same, and the f number then stays constant because it's f over a. All right, so this is f2, just like an SLR can have an f2 lens. All right, that's part of the discussion. So for each patch in the scene, let's say a little patch on my camera here, obviously a small lens is going to gather less light. You can imagine light leaving in all directions from every patch on, on the camera, and this will trap fewer of them. So that's kind of intuitive. But Due to the smaller focal length, it concentrates that light into a smaller area on the sensor. And if you look at the Gaussian lens construction, you can see that that's true. So the amount of light per unit area on the sensor actually stays constant and is therefore just a property of the F number. And so that's the irradiance, the light per unit area on the sensor. Oh, well, so it gathers less light from the object, but the same per unit area. So we're still not done yet. There are other properties we have to bring in to really understand, to really answer the question. A smaller focal length is accompanied by smaller pixels, typically, in order to keep the pixel count roughly the same. So not exactly the same. A big camera might have 20 or 30 megapixels, and this might have 13 or 12, but roughly the same, certainly not in proportion to the lens size. So if the pixels get smaller, then the scene patch covers the same number of pixels, but those are smaller pixels. Hence, each pixel gathers fewer photons, and as we'll see later in the course, it's noisier. So it does gather less light from each patch in the scene. It puts the same light per unit area on the sensor, but those pixels are smaller, and so they're worse. And that's the way to think about that. You have to often work through a number of these interrelated properties in order to answer a question like this. And we'll do a number of these as we go through the course.
Same area, but spread over more pixels, so less light per pixel.
Yeah, less light per pixel, and they're smaller pixels. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sorry?
Question. So why, I have like a D2, where I have like is it on? I have a D2H, Nikon D2, and it has, I think, 4 megapixels. And I thought 4 megapixels was wonderful. So why are they putting all these big pixel counts in these little cell phone cameras?
It's a good question.
If it's noisier, why wouldn't you just give me a 4 megapixel sensor and I'd be really happy?
Yeah, there are a number of factors there. First of all, you have to demosaic, and so you've got to do this interpolation, and you'd rather have a few more pixels to do that. People will crop.
How about 6 then?
Yeah, it's a good question. The read noise has gotten better, and we'll talk about this later on in the course. And so pixels can get smaller to a certain extent without terrible penalty. And then people will crop. But notice, for example, that Samsung went to 20 megapixels, but the others, like Apple, have not followed. And so there is a cliff that, other than lemmings, you probably don't want to go off of.
I think even the new Samsung, I think they stepped back down to like 12.
Samsung stepped back down to 12. Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, so the same thing happened in SLR, except for a few extreme cases. People have kind of pulled back or not gone off that cliff. Yeah, it's a very good question. Okay. All right, so the main side effect of the aperture, I talked about the main side effect of the shutter speed being motion blur. The main side effect of the aperture is depth of field. And doubling n, which is 2 f-stops, 2 square roots of 2, doubles the depth of field. So a small aperture opening and a larger aperture opening. So in London, there is a very simplified explanation of what causes depth of field. I will go through that now. It's not accurate. I will derive it geometrically next week. But it's worth going through this just to get a rough intuition. So the way London does it is he says, okay, a point on the object comes to a focus here, and there's the sensor. All right, fine. Actually, it comes to almost a point a little bit before and after that sensor. And if we allow ourselves to have a circle of confusion, meaning a blur that big, it's still mostly focused. And how big a blur we're allowing is called a circle of confusion. Later we'll relate it to pixel size. Okay, so if you can allow it to be a little bit out of focus, you're saying that there's a depth of focus allowable. That's inside the camera. That corresponds outside the camera to something called the depth of field. And the way to think about that is if this guy moved forward, if this guy moved backwards a little bit, then instead of his coat coming to a focus here, it would come to a focus here. If that's a little bit less than the size of that circle of confusion, we'll call it mostly in focus. And that's where we get the depth of field from. And then if the aperture is made smaller by stopping down the aperture, let's say it's half as big, then just by geometry you can see that this gets about twice as big. And the same thing will happen on this side. And that's the rule I just said before. Now that rule is not exactly accurate. And in fact, the whole idea that this is symmetrical around that middle point is actually incorrect. And we'll do a more careful derivation of this next week. But from 35,000 feet, this is actually roughly a good picture and a useful one. Okay. So, right, we'll fix it next week. All right, so those two side effects of freezing the motion and depth of field allow you to trade off those two effects by choosing combinations of shutter speed and F number that give you the same total irradiance falling on the sensor. That is the fundamental trade-off in photography. And so if you put a SLR into P mode, program mode, you will basically be able to choose one column from this chart. So for example, F16, which is a very small aperture, at 1/8 of a second, and you won't freeze the birds, but everything will be in focus. Or F2, which is a wide open aperture with a very short shutter speed, 1/500th of a second, and you'll freeze the birds, but the background's out of focus. Now, these two rows will slide relative to one another to give you different total exposure depending on how bright the scene is. But that's what the P mode does. The P mode chooses one column from among a diagram like this, possibly with the rows shifted. Okay, so those are the two variables for exposure. Are there any burning questions here? Yeah.
Just a quick one. What I've always wondered, the shutter speeds, are those numbers real? Shouldn't they be powers of 2?
Are the shutter speeds real? Yeah, well, certainly of a mechanical shutter, the attempt is to make that correct. But remember, the focal plane shutter actually has a slit, so it's an equivalent
Right, but what I'm
speed.
saying is if you double the shutter speed, it's going to double the amount of light.
Yeah.
So why aren't these exact powers of 2?
Oh.
He's expecting to be 816.
I mean, they are. It's just approximate here. And in fact, most cameras give you extra stops in between, so it's rough.
So
They don't want to say 7.5, so they say 8.
Okay, so it really is a power of 2 then.
I don't know what they actually calibrated at.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Why do lenses, as the f-stop goes down, down, and down, why do lenses get more and more expensive? Is it just that it's hard to make an aperture that wide?
Yes, that's exactly true. And we'll talk about aberrations next Wednesday and exactly what happens when you have a large aperture. That's exactly correct. The image gets worse. It's hard to make a good lens. Yes, good question. Question?
So videographers use T-stops, but photographers use f-stops. I heard that T-stops are actually a better measurement of allowed light.
I don't know the answer to that. I will find out and post something to the group mailing list. Florian in the back probably knows the answer.
T-stop takes the transmittance of the glass into account.
T-stops takes the transmittance of the glass into account. F-stop is just the geometric. Florian used to work for Industrial Light and Magic.
Cool.
Okay. All right. So there is one additional variable, which is the gain or the ISO. In film, it used to be called the ASA, which simply meant the American Standards Organization instead of the International Standards Organization. But basically what it is, in film, it used to trade sensitivity for gain. On digital sensors, what it does is it trades sensitivity for noise, and we'll talk about noise later on in the course. What it does is it multiplies the signal in analog and multiplies the voltage. We'll talk later about how sensors work before it gets converted to a number and before the analog to digital conversion. And that has a linear effect. So ISO 200 is multiplying the signal roughly by 2, ISO 400 by 4. And so you can think about that as just a longer exposure time or square root of 2 increase in the size of the aperture as far as its effect on exposure. It also has a side effect like the other two did. The side effect is noise in the case of digital sensing. And so here's a illustration of going from ISO 100 through ISO 12,800. So this, actually, this 5D Mark III goes up to ISO 25,000. It actually goes higher than that. It goes, I think, to 100,000. But at that point, you're just multiplying numbers after the digital conversion. You're not multiplying voltage anymore. So the only useful, you could do that in Photoshop. The only useful part is the part up to 25,000. And so when you spec out a camera, look for how much of it is analog ISO. All right. So we'll talk about more of that. So to relate all three of these variables together, there's a great little applet that we created at Stanford a little while ago. So there are a bunch of applets that will go along with this course. They're Flash applets. They're hooked into the course website. And here's what this one looks like. And so this is just obviously a simulation. And we put it in aperture priority mode so that I can fiddle with the aperture and it will make up for that using the shutter speed. And so looks like only the middle guy is in focus. If I move it like this, let's see. I can make it even shallower depth of field. So they're more out of focus because I've gone to lower F numbers, meaning a larger aperture, and you remember that diagram from London. And the exposure time makes up for it. If I go the other way, try to get everything in focus, uh-oh, something bad starts to happen in this simulation, which is handshake blur begins to come in, and everything is blurry because my exposure time is now 1/4 of a second. Okay, but there's this third variable. So let's take the ISO and increase it. If I increase it from 200 to 400, now I can make 1/8 of a second instead of 1/4 of a second, and so on. And so now I can get everything sharp and in focus. And uh-oh, whoa, now it's getting noisy. It's just fun to play with those variables and just remember what all of these do. Again, of course, this is a simulation. Okay. Yeah, Flash demo did that. All right. And some references, and those will all be in the slides. Okay, so let's switch to some history. And let's have a little bit of fun here. So history of photography. So there'll be several of these history vignettes throughout the course. Invention of photography, daguerreotypes, the era of portraits, and there'll be we'll continue this story in later lectures. All right, so we already talked about the camera obscura. Originally, it was just a pinhole, but it was discovered fairly early after the Renaissance that if you made a reasonable lens, you could gather more light. But it would still be sort of a camera obscura because it could be used by artists like that to draw. So did artists use these? Some certainly did. The most famous case is Vermeer. And so Philip Stedman and others have done reconstructions of what the camera obscura setup in this room probably looked like, because many of his portraits are in that a room that looks like that. And so he built a little doll model of the room and actually set it up with a camera. There's a kind of a big bellows camera there in order to make the view that is in his pictures, and use that to kind of hypothesize that this was probably the arrangement. And so there would be an aperture, might have been a lens, and it would make a perspectively correct, a linear perspective of the scene on the back wall of the room. Now there's a real question here. Did Vermeer's room look like this, or was it flipped and then did he rotate it? Or did he have some weird way of drawing on the back of in another room, in the adjacent room? Because otherwise this thing would be upside down and flipped, left to right. So, and Philip Stedman talks about that. And there's the picture. There are other artists that drew this way, and you can buy a tool, you can buy camera obscuras or similar tools like that now. All right, so that aside, the invention of recording photographic technology is usually attributed to Niepce. And he used bitumen, which is like asphalt without the stones, on a pewter plate, which is a tin alloy, and an 8-hour exposure, and captured an image out of his window in Paris. Not practical, but it is a recording of a scene done with a lens. So the more practical implementation of photography is Daguerre. So Daguerre is a really interesting guy. He had several careers before he invented daguerreotypes. He invented dioramas. And so this was actually the diorama. He calls it this, but the architect in me knows that he may have been a good photographer, but he was a lousy architect because that's not Gothic, it's Romanesque. But anyway, so he had these really cool buildings in which you would sit as an audience, and then stuff would change. And then when you were done looking at that one, you would, the entire audience would rotate to this and see a different scene. So it's like World's Fair stuff. And very creative. He would bring down fog, and he would have wind blowing and other things like that. It's the predecessor of modern dioramas, such as you might find in a natural history museum, which was pioneered by the American Museum of Natural History in New York. We'll talk a little bit more about dioramas in museums when we talk about lighting, because there are a number of interesting technical concepts there. All right, so here's a daguerreotype. So he used not asphalt without the stones, but a silver halide. And so halide, if you remember from your high school chemistry, is the second to rightmost column on the periodic table. So there are a number of silver halides that work. He used silver iodide, and then he bathed it in mercury to make it visible, and then salt water, that's right, in order to just stop the exposure. Nasty process. It produces no negative. It's done directly on a metal plate. And so it looks like this. One of the problems with this, aside from the fact that it produces no negative, is that if you've ever seen a daguerreotype, if you kind of move your head, you'll get this kind of reversal that I've simulated here in Photoshop. So it's a kind of a peculiar thing to look at, but it has very high detail, and that made it popular. As opposed to Talbot in England, so Daguerre was French, Talbot invented pretty much what we use today as paper photography. But, and so he used silver chloride, which is another of the halides, and he arrested the exposure with hypersulfite of soda, which we call now hypo. It's essentially the modern wet photography process. It produced a negative, so we could produce any number of positive prints. And then to describe what he was doing, Herschel, the astronomer, came up with the word photography. And that's where we get that from. It's kind of a sad story because he kept it secret. And so Daguerre came out with his process while Talbot was still keeping his secret. And then Daguerre, in order to prevent Talbot from exercising his work commercially, patented daguerreotypes only in England, just to stop Talbot. And so they fought for years. But eventually they both got licensed. And now we actually use paper photography, although it took a number of years. Okay. So this question, yeah.
Do you know what kind of lens these guys would have used?
I'll talk, yes. I don't know about this one in particular, but I'll talk about some of those old lenses in just a moment. Good question. So here's a daguerreotype portrait. It's a long exposure, something like 8 seconds, or even longer, so the sitter's head is stabilized with a metal brace in the back that you can't see there. And actually, but what you can see is that his hands are clenched in order to hold still for that long.
And the first photo of unboxing of a new camera?
Well, I don't know if he's unboxing it.
Is the Gigapixel kind of vignetted? Is that just an artifact of physically how the light comes through?
I don't know the answer to that.
Previous one,
Yeah, I don't know if it's vignetted naturally or not. Probably there's some vignetting in the lenses. So let's actually look at one of those lenses. So here's a camera of 1839. So one of the revolutions that really made photography more practical was after daguerreotype, people began to work hard on lenses. And 8-second exposures with clenched hands and metal braces just weren't really very practical. And so Petzval came up with the first practical portrait lens. So it's got 4 pieces of glass in 3 groups. A group means something that sits separately with air in between. And the key thing about Petzval is it's f3.7. And that reduced exposure time by 20x, which is important if exposure time was 8 or more seconds. Okay, so you should now know enough to tell me what the f number was of pre-Petzval lenses. If this is f3.7 and he reduced exposure time by 20x, so exposure time is going to be proportional to the size of the aperture. And that's going to be proportional. So you would have to reduce that by the amount of light or the area of the aperture by 20x. So that means the pre-Petzval apertures were 20 times smaller in area. So square root of 20 times smaller in diameter. And so the square root of 20 is 4.5. And so you would just multiply 3.7 by 4.5. And that comes out to 16.7. And actually, if we look at this lens, this is pre-Petzval, it's f15, which is very close. So that's a way you can actually use f numbers and do these calculations. Okay. Exposure time is, I guess it must have been a lot longer than that. So the exposure time is still 5 seconds after that. So I was mistaken in that previous slide. It must have been a much longer exposure. Manual shutter, because at 8 seconds, well, you know, you don't have to be too precise on the shutter speed. But despite this, there's some amazing portraits that come from that era. I don't know how these girls held still that well, but look at the detail on their clothing and their eyes. It's really quite extraordinary. Okay, so let's have some fun. Who are these people? Anybody know who this is? Let's start with some hard ones. That's Alexander von Humboldt, the South American explorer and father of meteorology. He wasn't always quite this ugly. Here's a painting of him when he was younger. All right. How about this guy? What's that? This is hard too. Samuel Morse, the inventor of the telegraph. So he was also a painter. That's not a picture of him when he was younger. That's a picture he painted of a woman. All right, something easier. How about this guy? Abraham Lincoln, before he grew his beard. Okay? He was 37 years old. How about this guy? Very good. I heard the correct answer is Edgar Allan Poe, the author. Right. How about this guy? No. Older than that. That's Lewis Carroll. Alice in Wonderland. So at this point, this is actually a later technology, which I'll talk about in a subsequent lecture. It's albumin, which is egg whites, and a wet plate photographic process. I'll talk about that later. And he took pictures of young girls looking like ragamuffins, although in fact she was the daughter of a wealthy next-door neighbor. He dressed her up like this, and that's Alice Liddell, and that's the basis for Alice in Wonderland, is that girl. Okay, last one. No, second to last one. So you'd have to be very old to know this one. This is Sarah Bernhardt, the most famous actress of the 19th century, Divine Sarah. Okay, last one. Back to hard ones again. So some people in my class at Stanford says, Virginia Woolf. Actually, it's Virginia Woolf's mother. Here's Virginia Woolf from a later picture. So again, an album print. Okay. All right. So as I said, this is mostly a fun day. We'll start some hairier math on Monday. So let's talk about extreme photography. So we're just going to go through a list of variables and show some technologies that fit onto these. And I'm sure you guys know some technologies I don't, and I can update the slides next year. All right, so high resolution as a variable. So you can go to Keeble and Chuckett in Palo Alto and you can rent one of these view cameras. These bellow cameras are still made and still used. And they have very high resolution digital backs you can rent or buy for them. So this is 80 megapixels. It's actually a little bit less than that, but you can do the so-called micro-stepping if you have a static scene and get 80 megapixels. So that includes the micro-stepping. Just want to remind you that some amazing resolutions have been designed for cell phones, like the Nokia 808, which is the 41 megapixel cell phone. So the way that one works is, let's say this is the sensor here. If we take the entire field of view of the sensor, we get then they average it down and you'll get a 5 megapixel averaged down wide angle field of view. Or they could crop out just the middle portion of it. And if they crop out the middle portion, then you get a narrow angle field of view and you still get 5 megapixels. So in either case, they could put out, maybe now they would put out 10 instead of 5, but they could put out the same number of pixel images that's either wide angle by averaging down or narrow angle by cropping. It's a clever solution, actually, to doing zoom without having moving parts. We'll talk about how telephoto lenses do zoom. They don't actually change the thickness of the glass next week. But it did make kind of a thick phone because you had to have a long focal length, and it's about 2 centimeters thick, which is not competitive by today's standards. Let me show you an image I took with one of these. It's my favorite backup for a frame buffer, which is a box of crayons. And if we zoom in, more, that's a single shot taken by that camera. So it's fun to have high resolution. So the highest resolution ever, maybe it's this one. So it's not that much, 111 megapixels. There is a 250 megapixel Canon sensor, but it's much smaller. This one's huge. It's the size of an entire wafer. So every pixel is 9 microns on a side. It makes it very sensitive, and so it's used for astronomy. Low yield means because it's wafer size, few of them come out without defects. And so it's super expensive. Okay. But let's talk about even higher resolutions. Graham Flint created this camera with large format negatives, which he then drum scanned to make a digital image. And so that's a gigapixel. And he built his own camera to go with it. And here's a picture that's hanging in the computer science building at Stanford, which is a gigapixel image. I need to hang a magnifying glass next to it. Here is one of his images of San Diego skyline, and we can zoom into the digital version of that image. So be careful what artwork you hang on your wall. Someone could be out there with a gigapixel camera. Oh, there's what that looks like. Kind of scary, huh? There's a great story that he told when he did a capstone at the International Conference on Computational Photography just a few years ago of when the Cuban Missile Crisis was happening. Timely story right now. And they wanted to distinguish camouflage from real trees in Cuba. The idea was to fly jets low and close over what the Russians might or might not have been building and use ultraviolet illumination and take a picture of the tree, because the spectral characteristics of camouflage would not be the same as the spectral characteristics of real trees. We'll talk about that more when we talk about color theory. So they needed to do some practice runs. They installed these giant ultraviolet lights on the bottom of a bomber and one of his cameras, and they flew low over the Florida swamps. So if you go back to 1963, you'll see lots of talks about UFOs over the Florida swamps. These purple glows, those were Graham Flint's bombing runs with the ultraviolet light and his camera, practicing for looking at the trees in Cuba. All right. Here's another way you can do super high resolution. Oh, sorry, question. Yeah.
For the previous image,
Yeah.
do you know what is the exposure time for that thing? The water reflection looks like maybe a little longer.
A little blurred.
No, the water reflects.
Yeah, it looks like it's blurred. That's a good point. Yeah, it's probably kind of long. Don't know. Remember, this was film and then digitally scanned, but I do not know the answer to that.
Is there a theoretical limit to how high resolution you should be
Yeah.
Could you see minute details inside that?
Good question. Diffraction does eventually limit it, and depends on the size of the lens. And so I'll actually talk about that very shortly. And then again next Tuesday. Question?
Are there challenges to focusing that camera?
I don't know how he focused it. Did he have a view? Maybe he did a view camera thing where he had a ground glass plate in the back and focused it that way. That's a good question. I don't know. It was fairly big, so it had a big back. Or he might have had another camera there and had them locked together. I actually don't know the answer. So another way you can get super high resolution is by taking multiple pictures with a panorama rig. So it doesn't necessarily create a weird shaped panorama. You could create a single planar projection depending on how you put them together. And the last lecture in this course is about stitching panoramas. So you have to rotate around the correct point. You want to rotate around the center of perspective if you're trying to create an ordinary panorama. And the center of perspective, as I mentioned earlier, is not out here, and it's not where the sensor is. It's somewhere in the middle of the lens. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on Monday. So these rigs have to rotate around that point. And if you look carefully, you'll see that that is exactly what this does. It a line between those two axes and up from, let's see, how does that rotate? Actually, I can't tell how the other rotation does. Oh, maybe it rotates around this thing. Is somewhere in the middle of the lens. So you can produce an image like this. They say that there's a climber on there, but I've actually never found him. Anyway, it's a gigapixel image. All right, switch to another variable. Let's talk about high speed. So any discussion of high-speed photography has to start with Harold Edgerton, Doc Edgerton, and his breakthrough was not a fast shutter. His breakthrough was a fast strobe. So he was the inventor of the electronic strobe. And so he would open the shutter and then position, in this case, a microphone next to his gun that he shot the bullet with, and that microphone would trigger the electronic strobe. And then he would have a certain delay, and it would take the picture at the right time. And he just took some absolutely amazing pictures. These are classic photographs. People know what this is? Water coming out of a faucet. Isn't that beautiful? This is from 1932. Look at the baseball. Multiple strobes. Look at the nice parabolic arc on the tennis ball. And then it leaves faster. Anybody know what this is? What is it? Atomic explosion. A very, very short exposure time. Camera was 7 miles away with a telescopic lens. More atomic tests. This is kind of creepy looking, isn't it? Like super creepy looking. Obviously those Joshua trees are about to be toast.
I don't see how the strobe would work on an atomic test.
Well, you don't need it for that. You just, oh, right. Oh, no, but that's a good question because I talked about electronic strobe. So he would need a fast shutter time for this.
Right.
And so he must have used different technology for this. Something like a fast, there were several other technologies. There's actually a great book on high-speed photography. You could either have a fan going by with a small hole, or you could actually put the film on a rotating drum and have it go by fast with a prism to keep the thing from smearing. There are a number of technologies to make extremely high-speed conventional photographs. It's a good point. I should have segued to other ways of doing high-speed photography. Of course, nowadays we can do high-speed photography. I think there's even some birds in here. This is done with a Nexus 6P. So you can do that with your Android cell phone. Isn't that beautiful? 240 frames per second, fairly high resolution. Do that in your backyard. Let's go a little bit higher speed video.
float low in the middle of the sea flow. Oh, don't know what the way that I'm supposed to go. I took a dive into the depths of the warm blue sea. Try to be free when nobody is watching me. Ha, so funny that I'm here today. Nobody's near today, no need to fear today. And if you have...
That's going. Low speed. Okay, so low speed, low light, take long exposures. This is a composite of 2 exposures. HDR Plus, which is a mode in the Google Camera app that ships on recent Nexus phones, can do low light photography. And the way it does it is it captures a burst of frames, might be 5 or 10 frames, depending on how much light there is, and aligns them and averages them together to form a single image. We're in the midst of publishing a paper on exactly how that works. But as we'll learn in the noise lecture, the signal-to-noise ratio rises as the square root of the number of frames, and we'll derive that mathematically. So the image gets cleaner as you average more frames by the square root of the number of frames you average. So here's an example. That's a single frame, and there's an average of maybe 8 or 10 frames. So it looks a lot better. When the Nexus 6P was launched, Dave Burke, the VP in Android, showed this image. This is 23 minutes after sunset and 3 different phones. Now they look about the same there, but if you zoom in, you see that the last year's Nexus and the iPhone are beginning to have to blur a little bit in order to hide the noise, whereas the 6P doesn't have to, and so it has greater sharpness. In general, the colors on iPhones are pretty good. Maybe that was an artifact here, but it had more light, so it could. It's just lucky. The white balance is okay. Actually, it's a little bit red for my taste. So here's 37 minutes after sunset, and the other 2 phones have just lost it, but it's still kind of a shareable image from the Nexus 6P. So here's an example from the reproduction of the Cave of Altamira that is in the Munich Deutsches Museum. It's a very dark room. You can't read in that room. And if you take a single frame looking up at the ceiling where these reproduced cave paintings are, it looks like that. And with HDR Plus, it looks like that. No flash being used here. So how far can you take this? You can take this very far. So in my 20% time, when I'm not using it to teach here, just a second, I'm writing an app called See in the Dark. And so here's my living room at 1/4 of a lux. So we'll learn about lux as a measure of irradiance on, we'll define lux precisely. It's lumens per meter squared. 1/4 of a lux is half of full moonlight. I can't read in 1/4 of a lux. And that's what the iPhone does. HDR Plus does a little bit better, although the white balance is not as good. And here's my app. So it's handheld. It's averaging lots of frames, so 50 or 100 frames real time as you're holding it. And I will try to release this app by the end of the course. Sorry, you had a question.
Yeah. So when you talk about the Nexus 6P, does all that apply to 5X too, or?
Yes. Yeah, it's got the same lens and sensor in it, and it's got the same software. The burst size might be a little bit smaller because the 5X may or may not be memory challenged. Right. Okay. So we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about noise. So more conventional long exposures. There's a 30-second exposure. 30-minute exposure. The stars rotate. What is the except for Florian, what is the non-moving star in the middle? Polaris, the North Star. So if you want to not have the stars rotate, you can build an equatorial mount for your camera or telescope. And so we'll have a lecture lit on astrophotography. Jesse Levinson will come in, as I said earlier, and he took this beautiful picture. And he's going to be mad at me for scooping him by showing that picture. It's 50 exposures of 3 minutes each, averaged together with a motorized camera mount. Gorgeous picture of Andromeda. So there are lots of other games you can play with these long exposure times. Painting with light, where you walk around and fire multiple flashes. Don't stand in the wrong place, or your shadow will be plastered onto your subject. There are lots of other versions of painting with light. You open the shutter and then walk around with an LED or bicycle light, and you can have a lightsaber contest. or make an effect like that. There's just so many interesting games you can play with long exposures and lights. Okay, small aperture. So the king of small apertures probably is Ansel Adams. And he formed this movement called this club called the F64 Club. And we'll talk more about that in the context of the history of photography in the 20th century later. So F64 means a very small opening, so it's going to have a very deep depth of field. Everything's going to be in focus, and that was the aesthetic he was looking for. So F64 sounds completely unreasonable. No SLR has that, but it's not as unreasonable as it sounds. So if you work the numbers, let's see. So a typical SLR with a 50 millimeter lens like this, if you stop it down to F16, which is not even its smallest, that's about a 3 millimeter opening. 50 over 16 is 3. So the diameter is 3 millimeters. So if we look at Ansel Adams, he had an 8-inch lens, which, what's the number? It's 203 millimeters. So the focal length. So it's a very long focal length in a big view camera. And so F64 for that, if you work the triangle of numbers, that would also be about a 3 millimeter opening. So his opening was about the same as this. Now, what a high F number like that does, as we'll learn next week, is it creates a large diffraction spot size. So diffraction goes as the F number, no questions asked. So he had a big diffraction spot size. But hey, if you've got a 4x5 negative, it doesn't matter so much. If you have tiny, tiny pixels that are just a few microns, you don't want a large diffraction spot size. But if you've got a 4x5 negative, you can tolerate it. So he tolerated a large diffraction spot size, still got an adequately sharp image because of the huge size of his negatives, and got everything in focus.
Isn't that why you get starbursts when you have when you stop your camera down and you look at light? You shoot light, you see little rays coming out.
Oh, a lot of things could cause that. The leaves of the aperture could cause that, whether they're stopped way down or not.
Would you put focus stacking in that category? The modern version of that?
Focus stacking.
You know, taking a lot.
Oh, in order to get everything in focus? But then you'd have to run a computational photography algorithm probably to select those pixels that are in focus. Yeah, you could do that.
One button in Photoshop.
And that's right. Makes some mistakes sometimes, especially at the occlusion edges of objects. In microscopy, that's used as well a lot, that kind of focal stacking and a computational algorithm. Yeah, I should actually add that to the lecture. Thanks, that's a good point. Okay, large aperture. So classic shallow depth of field images. We'll talk about this when we talk about the history of the use of photography for social good later on in the course. So we can also do this computationally and synthetically. And so if we want to simulate the shallow depth of field that would cause this red point to be out of focus, in other words, cause a big blur there, and we had an array of small cameras, then we could simulate this approximately. If we wanted to create a focused image of that point using an array of cameras, we just need to compute those rays that those pixels from each camera's view that with interpolation approximate what's happening here, add them together, and there's an approximate focused view of that. So this is called light field refocusing. And we can do this with a physical array of small cameras. This is at Stanford. We're going to look through the bushes after removing that calibration target. And then by, so in one view, the cameras themselves are focused on the bushes, but there's this synthetic effect of adding them all together. So if you just add them all together, you might get a blurry mess like this. If you shift them before you add them in various ways, then that's approximating what I just said about selecting those rays. And you can bring each of the camera's views into alignment at some depth. By changing the amount of shift, you change the depth at which all those images will align, and you can focus your way synthetically through the bushes, across the street, through my grad students, and then there's a ladder in the building there in the distance. And all I'm doing is I'm taking images from different cameras and shifting them. And what that is doing is approximating the effect of having had a large aperture, a 6-foot aperture.
You're not physically shifting, you're just translating the pixels.
I'm just translating the pixels, that's all. So this same principle is in the Litro camera. Renning, who founded Litro, was a student in our lab at Stanford. And so it's done a little bit differently. It doesn't have an array of cameras. It has an array of micro lenses inside here that effectively captures the same information, separately capturing each ray so that they can be added in ways that allow these shifts. So we'll talk about light field photography later on in the course. Here's another version of the same idea of a synthetic large aperture. It's an app I wrote before joining Google, where I would take an iPhone and move it like this. So I could take the little tiny aperture here and simulate, you can see the way I'm recording, simulate by aligning and averaging all those images, simulate a large aperture. So I could sweep out what might be the size of a 50mm aperture and produce an image like you see on the right, just by aligning and averaging images. And so I can get single frame or synthetic aperture photograph. This is actually the trace of all the images where I was for every image that I added together. And you can, by tilting it in a variety of ways, you can do these weird tilt shift photographs. So we'll talk about tilt shift in a couple of weeks. All right, let's keep going through extremes. Narrow field of view. So this is a great time to plug Bryan Peterson's book. He has many pages that look like this, where he says, well, you could have taken this picture. It's an okay picture of the Golden Gate Bridge, but isn't this a stronger composition? And all he did was he zoomed in. And arguably that is a stronger picture. And that's often a key to getting a strong picture. Look for an element in there that has an interesting design. So if you want to zoom in a lot, there are lots of ways you can do it. So this is not a set of lenses. This actually is a reflector like reflector telescope. So it's got this bounce path inside that lens, which also means that the aperture effectively has a hole carved out of the middle of it for the other mirrors, which makes, as we'll see on Monday, the shape of the out of focus spots look a little bit funny, what's called the bokeh. We'll talk about that on Monday. So you can take pictures like this or this. How far can you push that? Pretty far. I think these are rather expensive. It looks like an oil chic for which this one was made. There's a 2000mm. How far can you push this? Well, large telescopes are just big cameras. Palomar is no longer the largest in the world. The largest is 400 inches. But let's work this through. The diameter of the aperture is 200 inches. It's a 16-foot aperture. By the way, it's not this thing. That's just a mechanical support. It's this thing from here to there. That's the actual telescope. All right, so A is 200 inches. F, the focal length. It's bounced through mirrors, but you can still compute the focal length. Rays that are parallel, like from the distant stars, will come together how far away from the beginning of the optical system? And the answer is 650 inches, or 50 feet. That's why the telescope's so big. And if you form the ratio F over A, you get 3.3. So this is just, fairly ordinary F number. It's an F3.3 lens, or optical system. Wide field of view. Okay, so wide field of view, obviously stitched panoramas make wide fields of view. Crater Lake in Oregon. So this is 4 photos. By the way, you can do some interesting tricks with an ordinary camera. If you, instead of taking a picture like this, being careful to rotate around here, if you do something like this, and then put them into Photoshop and stitch them together, you get that kind of curved world effect. There are all kinds of interesting games you can play with stitched panoramas. Or you can just go out and buy yourself this lens, which costs 11 pounds and takes wide-angle pictures. And just this week, it's special on eBay. Or you can go out and buy this camera, the Ricoh Theta S, which is pretty compact and has a slightly more than 180-degree fisheye lens on each side. And so you can take pictures. It makes kind of funny pictures because everything is in the picture. There's no way to hide your tripod, your lighting equipment, or your hand. So smile. I'm going to smile at the same time. And just take a picture of everything. I'll post it later. You can trigger it from your phone so you can get out of the way. So here's an example picture. And so the place where the phone was is actually there. And what it actually does is it has a little computational algorithm to erase the phone. So that looks kind of weird, but you can take a small part of it. That looks a little bit better. What's interesting here is that I'm looking directly at her. Doesn't look like that, does it? Well, it's a fisheye. All the lines are curved, including the lines of sight. We are actually looking at each other. I remember when I took the picture. Yeah.
So the fisheye lens will have those kind of weird distortion, but if it's a perfect pinhole camera, there shouldn't be that kind of distortion, right? If you just shorten the focal length.
Being a pinhole camera, the size of the aperture is a separate question than what the field of view is. You could still make a nearly pinhole fisheye lens.
What causes this distortion?
It's just a matter of how wide a set of rays are brought in. And because it's rather difficult to bring them in straight, the lenses have distortions. We'll talk about those distortions next week. And that tends to create the fisheye effect. You could try to have the sensor be curved, and that would eliminate some of them. But the standard thing is that the lens, it's just hard for a lens to bend the rays to make a linear perspective. The laws of Snell's law, basically. We'll talk about this next week, but Snell's law doesn't actually lead to a correct linear perspective when you get to these extreme wide angles. What's really fun about the Ricoh is to use their app. So let's see if I can switch to their app. All right, we'll figure this out just a second. Yeah, let's try that. And start the video. So there I am bicycling on Skyline, holding it in front of me. There I am. So here I am holding it. And here's the small world. Isn't that fun? It's a fun camera. Should all go out and buy one and play with it. Oh, I didn't risk my life. I just holding it in front of me. What are they? I don't know. I just charged it to my G card. It's about $350, yeah. What's that? Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about even wider angle. So the beginning of the Street View project was actually the Google-sponsored Stanford research project called City Block. And we took a camera, put it in the back of a pickup truck, and went down Castro Street in Mountain View, and took these sideways-looking videos, and then took the middle column out of every frame of video, just the middle column, and made this panorama. So this is not the way Street View works currently. This technology was not used in the end. But you can summarize an entire city block in a single picture this way. So if you think about that, if I take just the middle picture, the middle column out of every frame of video as a camera moves sideways, it's not going to be a perspective view, not a single point of projection. It'll actually turn out to be a single point of projection vertically, because there's this field of view that's moving like this down the street. But horizontally, every viewing direction is parallel. So it's orthographic is the name for a perspective when the vanishing point's at infinity. It's orthographic horizontally and perspective vertically. Now I could take the right column out of the last frame and the left column out of this frame and make a vanishing point horizontally, it could be different than the vanishing point vertically. That's called the cross slits projection. There are all these interesting projections if you want to get into that. So see if anyone can recognize this one. You'll never get this. All right, ready? It's 19th Street in San Francisco. Notice the hill. So it wasn't used. The reason it wasn't used in Street View is for objects that were not on a particular nominal plane, they would get distorted. So cars in front or plazas in back would become too wide or too squished. And it looked kind of funny. And so Street View eventually decided to do these panoramic bubbles at discrete locations. Microsoft has recently tried to rejuvenate this idea, and they call it slide panoramas. It hasn't really caught on either. But it's a funny kind of a projection. All right, high dynamic range. So if you take different exposures or exposure times or aperture settings, exposure time is the easiest one because then the depth of field doesn't change. You can capture everything from the deepest shadows at Memorial Church at Stanford to the skylight. And then you take the highlights from the low exposure and you take the shadows from the longest exposure and combine them together. How you combine them is not at all straightforward. And we'll talk about that in one of the last lectures of the course. We'll talk about tone mapping for high dynamic range imaging. This is an extreme example where the dynamic range, which we'll define a little bit more precisely later when we talk about metering, of film is about that. Maybe it's a little bit higher. Paper prints are fairly low, but the dynamic range of this example is 250,000 to 1. I'll make this more precise when we talk about metering. You can do this yourself. So here I am in Zurich, and it's a little bit dark on the left side. So I'll take 2 shots. Now it's a little bit bright on the right side, but I'll take those 2 shots into Photoshop, align them, and Photoshop has some high dynamic range imaging. So you can get a nice picture. The problem with making this kind of automatic and handheld for consumers is that it's hard to robustly handle the camera shake because you've got to align stuff. And the amount of noise changes as you change the exposure time, as the applet showed you. And so things don't look quite the same, and your alignment might fail. If objects move, your alignment can fail. If the camera moves, the alignment can fail. If one of the exposures is so long that parts of the scene saturate, meaning the pixels just turn white, then there are no features there, you can't align it at all. So it's very hard to make that robust. And so in the Google Camera app, the HDR Plus mode does this same thing, but a different way. Instead, what we do is we capture a burst of underexposed images, the same exposure for every frame. It's completely non-obvious. We're not bracketing. But by underexposing, we avoid blowing out the highlights. And by taking the same exposure, the alignment is much more robust. So you don't see ghosts on HDR Plus images. And by aligning and averaging multiple images, as I already described, it reduces noise in the shadows. And so you've avoided blowing out highlights. You've avoided excessive noise in the shadows. You combine them together to make a single image with more bits, like 14 bits. And then you have to tone map it, which means boosting the shadows. But if you just boost the shadows, you'll get a washed out look, and that's the tone mapping problem. And basically, you want to enhance local contrast at the expense of global contrast. So we'll talk about that later on in the course. But here's an example. It's blown out on the right there, and here's an HDR Plus image. These are just taken with the Nexus 6P. Look at the stained glass windows. So you probably, hopefully all have a Nexus 6P or 5X and have taken similar images. Question?
Quick question on that.
Yeah.
What's the point of taking multiple underexposed images at the same exposure instead of just making a virtual copy? Like, unless I misunderstood.
No, that's a reasonable question. Why not just make copies of that image? Because the noise will be, if a pixel is a little bit too bright or a little bit too dark, it'll be the same little bit too bright, a little bit too dark if you just make copies. What you want is the noise to be different on every frame, which it is normally.
You couldn't just fake that by throwing a randomized filter on it?
No, because the mean of those won't be the right number. The only way to do that is to actually capture the images. That's a perfectly reasonable question. Yeah. So we'll talk about that when we talk about noise models. All right, lastly, low dynamic range. And so I kind of had to, sorry, question?
Sorry, there's a question on, so you're taking the burst mode, right?
Yeah.
1/60th was good handheld, so are you taking?
We're taking longer than that in low light. So the HDR Plus does both high dynamic range and low light. And so it varies from phone to phone, but generally will go up to a 15th of a second, which means that some of them are going to be blurry. So you want to do, I'm jumping ahead of myself a bit in the course, we're doing what's called lucky imaging, where we'll downweight or eliminate in some way the blurred frames.
So each sample is like 1/15th.
In the very lowest light. Generally, it's we'll try to use shorter exposures, but we might use as long as 15th of a second.
What would you say about the battery, the total time your battery exposure?
Yeah, that's that little circle that goes around when you use HDR Plus mode. And if you don't hold still for that, you'll still get an image. It won't produce ghosts or anything, but you won't be able to denoise it as much if you've moved your camera away too fast. Yeah. And that's why we put up that little circle. Yeah.
So can we apply the same technology to improve video as well?
Very interesting question. Can we apply the same thing to video? I think so, and I have someone on my team working on that. The idea is you take each frame as the reference frame and you try to average all the other ones to it and then go to the next frame and use it as the reference frame, and yes, it works. Good question. Oh, this is a great audience.
If you do really high FPS, can you then, because you were saying, does it help to have a lot higher frame rate than the standard video? Like, so if you have something like, let's say, you have 240 FPS,
Yeah.
do you have better information to work with to try to do that averaging? If you wanted to take 240 and convert it to like 30 or 60, would that be able to?
No, I don't know that that's advantageous. The motion blur can be done differently depending on how you align it. So you could produce sharp images instead of motion blurred images. But as far as the actual noise reduction, I don't think you're getting any advantage there. Okay. The last slide here. Question in the back, yeah?
One more question about differing shutter speeds for HDR.
Yeah.
Like the first example image that you had. What keeps, let's say you had a camera and it would take one exposure as long as the longest exposure that you wanted, but kind of slice it at the shorter exposure times. Is that just a consequence of how?
What do you mean slice it?
Sorry.
What do you mean slice it?
So we take let's say you had a range from like 1/125th to 4 seconds, and we say we will have we'll keep the shutter open for 4 seconds, but we'll take a snapshot.
Oh, you'll read
how
back.
exposed it is at,
Yeah, so there are a number of camera technologies that try to do exactly that, to try to read back at intermediate stages. It's tricky from a pixel design standpoint to read it back non-destructively. So it is a challenge, but there are some cameras that try to do that. Remember the speed, but if it saturates, do you want to reset it? Maybe you want to read it back and reset it, but then how different is that? You know, there's some technologies, we'll talk about this a little bit more later on the course, some technologies try to count the time to saturation. There's another, there are lots of options to try to get around that problem. We'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about high dynamic range imaging at the end of the course. All right, let me go on just so I can finish up today's material. All right, so here's an example of very low dynamic range imaging. So I'm trying to read a credit card that is in the back of a fish tank full of milk. So, yeah. Well, I had a sabbatical at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and seeing through murky water was actually something they really wanted to do. And I've got two cameras aimed at it. I've got an ordinary SLR, you can see that here. And then I've got that same Sinar camera that I showed at the beginning, which has huge pixels. And so here's what the SLR could see of the credit card, and here's what that sensor can see. It's got big pixels, it's actively cooled, and as we'll see when we talk about the noise lecture, the temperature of the sensor makes a difference. and it's got 14 real bits that it returns, meaning the low order bits are not all noise. And you 800, call AT&T. Okay, so we've got one more very quick thing to do today, and just enough time to do it, and that is choosing the camera if you're going to choose a camera. So I remember from the survey last time that a lot of you already have pretty good cameras, but if you were to choose a camera, remember this important rule. So you can take good pictures with cell phones in many cases. These were taken, that's a Nexus 6, I think, in Turkey, and 6S. Here's an HDR plus picture. So you can take really nice pictures for sharing as long as you don't need a long lens. So it's the long focal length or the shallow depth of field the cell phones don't have. But this is a very high dynamic range scene, and it was captured with HDR plus. So it can take pretty good pictures. But the lens matters. The lens gives you the shallow depth of field. The lens gives you the narrow angle of view. And so there are reasons to buy an SLR. So don't get a point and shoot. At this point, there's no point. The cell phones are really almost as good. The micro four thirds are fine. If you want to do the assignments in this course, you'll need manual control over shutter and aperture. Don't worry about the number of megapixels. All of them have enough. And don't worry about the brand that much for the body. But do worry about the lenses. And so the quality of the glass really is important. The variable zooms are convenient, but there is a trade-off in quality. We'll talk about that next week. The so-called super zooms that go from 18 to 250 are getting better, but they're still a bit soft, meaning they don't produce as sharp an image at the two extremes of the zoom. The maximum aperture, meaning the lowest f number or lowest f-stop, does matter because you want to capture light. And so it's worth having a fast prime lens. So fast means a low f number, a big piece of glass like this, 50 millimeter 1.8. And it also, a prime means a single focal length, not a variable zoom. So this focuses, but it doesn't change its focal length. So it changes its focus distance, but not focal length. It's worth having one of those for evening work, and a tripod. But you don't need a giant tripod. You can get one of these little itty bitty things, and they work just fine. I always carry one of those with me. And flash, the farther your flash is from the lens, the better it will be. We'll talk about flash later on in the course. So having a flash that points at the ceiling is even better because then you get indirect lighting. We'll talk about that. Most of them have video capability at this point. Count on spending this much for it. And there are lots of resources. This is out of date, but DP Review is a good place to go to look for reviews of cameras. But there are lots of other places you can go instead. And so with that, we'll finish, and we will start on Monday. Gird your loins for optics derivations on Monday. We'll try to make it as gentle as possible.